The morning began with a hush across the prairie, as though the world itself was caught between breaths. Spring lay fresh upon the land. Dew clung to every blade of grass, and a faint mist drifted low over the earth, curling around fence posts and the trunks of cottonwoods like smoke. The sky was pale with the first light, streaked with fragile pinks and golds that promised warmth after the long months of cold. A hawk circled high, its wings spread wide, cutting arcs through the rising sun. Beneath it, a lone rider moved across the open stretch, broad, deliberate, heavy in frame, as if the land itself had shaped him. Jackie Sutherland sat astride his bay horse, shoulders squared beneath the worn leather of his vest, eyes dark and steady. He was a man the prairie had chiseled down to silence and muscle, his words fewer than most, his gaze sharper. He rode toward home, the Sutherland Ranch, a modest sprawl of weathered timbers and sloping roofs tucked between the wide grass and a stand of budding cottonwoods. The earth smelled of damp soil and new blossoms, that particular scent spring gives, both tender and raw. Jackie felt it, though he gave no outward sign. His jaw was set, his hands easy on the reins, his thoughts private. A man who had buried more than he cared to count learned to keep his grief folded tight, like letters left unread in a drawer. From the kitchen windows of the ranch house, a faint glow pulsed in rhythm with the fire inside. The scent of bread and herbs seeped out, carried by the damp wind. That was her work. Jing Lian, the girl who had come from the edges of another world, now stood within his home, her presence steady and quiet, as if she had always belonged among the wooden beams and flickering lanterns. She was 25, small in stature yet precise in every movement. Where others wasted, she stretched. Where others complained, she bore the silence with grace. Her black hair was bound simply at the nape of her neck, her sleeves rolled as she kneaded dough on the wooden table. Her eyes, dark as midnight, flicked to the door when it opened. She did not flinch at the sound of boots against the boards. Jackie stepped in, the smell of horses and rain clinging to him, a figure filling the room as the light bent around him. For a moment, the air seemed to pause between them, as though it were unsure whether to press forward or hold still. He said little, only laid his hat on the peg and washed his hands at the basin. She continued her work, though her gaze strayed for just a second too long, and that was enough. Jackie was a man who noticed. His eyes, steady as river stones, caught the faint discoloration along her cheekbone where the firelight brushed her face. A bruise, thin as a shadow yet undeniable. He did not speak at once. He dried his hands, sat at the edge of the table, and studied the bread rising in its bowl as if the answer were hidden in its swelling shape. Jing felt his attention, though he did not name it. She kept her hands moving, pressing dough with soft strength, but her chest tightened. She knew what he saw. She knew he would not let it rest. And when his voice came, low and careful, it seemed to tremble not from hesitation but from a weight heavier than anger. Just that. A single word, dropped like a stone into a still pond. Her hands stilled on the dough. For a moment she thought of lying, of saying she slipped, of saying it was nothing. But lies were useless under the gaze of a man who measured truth not by words but by silence. She swallowed and turned slightly, her voice no louder than the crackle of the fire. Settler men. At the market. They were drinking. They wanted, she faltered, pressing her lips together. They laughed when I would not smile. One of them pushed me against the barrels. Then another struck me. Her words trailed off into the space between them. Jackie did not move, but something in him shifted, like a horse lowering its head before a charge. His jaw tightened, the cords in his neck drew taut, and his eyes darkened, though his voice remained calm, almost too calm. Names. She shook her head quickly, her hair brushing across her cheek. No, please. It is finished. But it was not finished. Not for him. The prairie had taught Jackie Sutherland many things. That storms always came, that herds wandered, that men could turn cruel when hunger or pride drove them. But it had also taught him that a man's worth was shown in what he chose to protect. And in that moment, he knew what he had chosen. Jing turned back to her dough, hands trembling slightly, ashamed of the weakness her story revealed. She had survived a voyage across an ocean, endured hunger that gnawed the bones, crossed mountains with strangers who treated her as less than human, and yet she had borne it all. Only here, With a bruise upon her face and the quiet gaze of a man who noticed, did she feel the sharp sting of humiliation. Jackie stood slowly. His chair scraped back. She kept her eyes on the bread, unwilling to meet the storm she felt in him. He took his hat again and walked to the door. His silence was louder than rage. Jing turned then, her hands dusted in flour, her eyes wide with sudden fear. "Where are you going?" His hand rested on the doorframe. For a long moment he did not answer. The firelight traced the hard line of his shoulders, the scar that curved along his arm, the stillness of a man who had chosen his path before speaking it aloud. Then he stepped out into the fading light, his figure swallowed by the dusk. Jing stood there, heart pounding, her question unanswered. She pressed her flour-dusted hands to her chest as though to steady her breath. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain. The cottonwoods swayed. She thought of the men's laughter, the way their hands had shoved her, the sting of the blow that had left its mark. Fear pressed against her ribs, but beneath it there stirred something else, something that unsettled her even more, an ache of gratitude, of being seen. As the evening deepened, she lit a lantern in her small room, its glow soft against the walls. She sat by the narrow bed, listening to the faint creak of boards, the restless sound of horses shifting in the barn. But Jackie did not return to the house. Hours passed. She whispered prayers in her tongue, prayers she had spoken since childhood, words carried across seas, fragile as threads yet unbroken. Out by the cottonwoods, Jackie stood with his back against the trunk, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the horizon. His silence was his armor, his thoughts a fire banked deep within. He knew what men like the Yates brothers were, loud when drunk, cruel when unchecked, always ready to strike where they thought no one would rise to stop them. And he knew, with the certainty of dawn, that he would not let it stand. Not here. Not against her. The stars thickened overhead, sharp and clear. A coyote cried somewhere far off, the sound thin and mournful. Jackie did not move. His horse nickered in the dark, as though sensing the storm that brewed in its master's chest. Inside, Jing lay down but could not sleep. Her cheek throbbed faintly with the memory of the blow, but it was not the pain that kept her awake. It was the image of Jackie's eyes when he asked who. They had not burned with fury as she expected. They had burned with something deeper, heavier, as if he had taken the bruise into himself. She turned her face into the pillow and let the tears come, soundless, ashamed of her own weakness yet unable to stop them. The prairie wind rattled the shutters. Spring rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the roof, blurring the edges of the night. The lantern flickered and died, leaving the cabin in shadow. Jing closed her eyes, but the sound of Jackie's boots outside, pacing slow and measured across the porch, told her sleep would not come. By dawn, the rain had ceased, leaving the earth fresh and glistening. The grass shone with droplets, the cottonwoods dripped steady. Jing stepped out onto the porch, her shawl wrapped tight, her hair damp with mist. Jackie was already there, saddling his horse. His movements were efficient, wordless, each strap pulled tight, each buckle fixed as if he prepared for more than a simple ride. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice breaking the morning stillness. "Please, do not." He did not look up. The saddle cinch tightened with a tug. The horse shifted, ears flicking. "Jackie, please. They will only grow worse." At that he did raise his head, his eyes meeting hers across the damp morning. For a moment, she saw not the giant rancher but the man beneath, the weariness carved by years, the loneliness carried like a stone in the chest, the grief of someone who had buried more than he told. His gaze softened, but his resolve did not. He stepped into the stirrup, swung into the saddle, and turned the horse toward town. Jing gripped her shawl tight, her breath quick with fear. The prairie stretched endless before him, silver with dew, the path to town glistening like a blade. She felt the pull of fate, heavy and certain, yet could do nothing to stop it. As his figure grew smaller against the horizon, the mist rising to swallow him, Jing whispered to the empty air, not sure if it was prayer or plea. And the land, vast and watchful, seemed to listen. The saloon door swung open with a groan that silenced laughter for a heartbeat before the noise rushed back in, fuller than before, as though eager to test whether the tall man at the threshold would flinch. Jackie Sutherland filled the frame, rain still darkening his hat and shoulders, boots heavy with mud from the ride. He said nothing as he stepped in, letting the door fall shut behind him, his presence cutting a slow line through smoke and chatter. Men shifted on their stools, some smirking, others avoiding his eyes. The piano stopped mid-chord. He walked toward the counter with the same quiet deliberation he brought to branding cattle or mending fence posts. Not haste, not hesitation, just that unshakable rhythm of a man who did not measure time the way others did. At the far table sat Franklin and Carl Yates, brothers cut from the cloth of men who believed size and volume made strength. Franklin, lean and sharp-nosed, leaned back in his chair with a grin that spread too easily, while Carl, broader with a mean droop to his mouth, nursed a mug of whiskey and spit into the sawdust. They laughed as Jackie passed, the kind of laughter that curled at the edges like rot. Franklin called out, loud enough to carry. "Didn't know you kept pets, Sutherland. Thought a man like you had better taste." The saloon held its breath. Jackie did not pause, only placed a coin on the counter for the barkeep, who wiped his hands nervously on a rag. "Whiskey," Sutherland said, low and even. His voice held no heat, yet it settled heavy across the room. The glass was poured, slid down the counter. Jackie let it sit untouched. His gaze drifted toward the Yates brothers, steady, unreadable. Carl shifted in his chair, raising his chin with forced bravado. "You hear him, Frank? He don't deny it. Don't even argue. Guess the China woman cooks him more than stew." The laughter this time was thinner, some men chuckling because silence felt more dangerous. Jackie stood, lifted the glass, and carried it not to his mouth but to their table. He set it down in front of Franklin with deliberate care. Franklin blinked, confused, before Jackie spoke. "That's paid for. Same as the debt you left at the counter last month. Same as the feed you owe McCarthy. Same as the tools you never paid Jeremiah Klein." Franklin's grin faltered, but Jackie's voice did not rise. His words carried a weight sharper than any fist. "That is the price of cowards who strike women. Men who earn nothing on their own but spend their spit on the helpless." The silence afterward was raw. A chair creaked. Outside, a horse stamped in the mud. Carl's face reddened. He half rose, fist tightening, but Jackie did not flinch. He only stood there, towering, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes fixed as though the Yates brothers were already smaller than dust. Franklin broke the stillness with a laugh that sounded too brittle. "We don't take kindly to a man shaming folks in their own place." Jackie leaned closer, his shadow stretching across the table, his words dropping into the narrow space between them. "Then be men worth shaming." And with that he turned, left the untouched glass where it stood, and walked out, the saloon's noise breaking back in only after the door swung shut behind him. The brothers sat stiff, faces tight, but no one met their eyes. The barkeep poured another drink with shaking hands. A murmur spread, one of those whispers that carried far in small towns. Sutherland won't let it go. On the road home, Jackie rode with the rain in his face, the horizon blurred into gray. His jaw was clenched, his chest heavy with the kind of silence that suffocates more than speech. He had not raised a fist, yet he felt the tremor of violence in his bones, the ache of knowing it was not finished. Men like Franklin and Carl did not forget shame. They nursed it, fed it, sharpened it until it cut deeper. Back at the ranch, the fire still glowed. Jing stood near it, her shawl around her shoulders though the night was not so cold. She looked up when he entered, searching his face for answers. He said nothing at first, only hung his hat and moved to the hearth, stretching his hands toward the flames. She waited, patient in her fear, until at last she asked, "You found them?" He nodded once. "And what did you do?" His eyes caught the firelight, glinting like steel. "I paid their debts." Her brow furrowed, not understanding. "So they know what they owe. And they know I know." Her hands gripped the shawl tighter. "That will not stop them." "No." The single word struck harder than any reassurance. She turned away, her throat tight. She had lived too long with men who smiled at her silence, men who treated her labor as invisible. She knew what men did when pride was bruised. And yet, there was something in the way Jackie stood, immovable, that made her believe for the first time that her suffering was not only her own. The days that followed stretched taut with unspoken tension. Jing worked as always, her hands slicing vegetables, her feet padding soft across the wooden floor. But her eyes flickered often to the door, expecting it to burst open with laughter too sharp, fists too eager. Jackie tended the ranch, hammering loose boards, moving cattle to greener pastures, but he carried the weight of watching as if it were another chore. His silence grew heavier, though not unkind. One afternoon, as he mended a fence along the pasture, she approached, hesitant. The sun lay warm across the grass, the scent of blossoms sweet in the air. She stood a few paces off, shawl fluttering in the breeze, her voice quiet. "You are not bound to me. I can leave, if it will keep them from you." He looked up, the hammer stilled in his hand. For a long moment he studied her, the wind shifting through the tall grass, the sky a wide, endless blue. Then he set the hammer down and walked toward her, his step slow. "You wish to leave." She lowered her eyes. "No." His gaze lingered, searching her face. Her bruises nearly faded now, but her fear etched deep. Then he nodded, as if something within him settled. "That's enough." It was not a declaration, not a vow, but something quieter and steadier. She felt it in her chest like the first warmth after winter. That night, Jing lit a candle in her small room and whispered old words she had nearly forgotten, prayers her mother once taught her under lantern light. For the first time in years, she prayed not only for endurance but for belonging. The flame flickered gently, casting shadows that danced across the walls, shadows that seemed less cruel than before. Yet the town did not rest easy. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some said Sutherland had taken a Chinese girl under his roof and bed. Some spat the words with contempt, others with envy. Old Jeremiah Klein warned Jackie when they crossed paths at the blacksmith's. "You're picking a fight you don't need. Folks don't forgive easy, not when pride and color mix." Jackie listened, nodded, and went on shoeing his horse. He did not explain himself. He did not need to. Jing, meanwhile, bore the weight of those whispers in silence. When she walked through town for supplies, women turned their faces, men looked too long, and children stared with the cruel curiosity of youth. She held her head down, but inside she burned with shame. At night she lay awake, asking herself if she had doomed the man who had shown her kindness. One evening, unable to contain it, she told him the truth. She stood in the kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I was promised once, in California. Promised for work, but it was not work they wanted. I escaped, came here, and still I am hunted, if not by the same men, then by others." Jackie stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his face shadowed. She braced for pity, for judgment, but his voice was steady as the earth itself. "No one owns you here." Her throat closed with tears she had held too long. She turned away, pressing her hands to her face, ashamed of the weakness. Yet in that weakness was a release, the faintest sense of safety. Outside, the prairie wind rose, carrying the distant howl of coyotes. The sky bruised purple with twilight, torches already flickering in the far-off dark. Jackie stepped to the porch, watching the horizon, his silhouette rigid against the fading light. He knew the Yates brothers were not finished. He knew the weight of shadows only lengthened before dawn. Jing stood at the window, the candlelight behind her, and saw what he saw, shapes moving in the distance, too many to be harmless. Fear coiled tight in her chest, but alongside it, something else stirred, the faint, fragile belief that perhaps this time she would not stand alone. The prairie did not forget. Word drifted on the wind, carried from porch to porch, whispered in the saloon, muttered at church pews and around water troughs. Jackie Sutherland was sheltering a Chinese girl beneath his roof, and worse than that, he had stood for her when men laid hands upon her. To some, it was proof of his decency, the quiet mark of a man who would not let cruelty rule. To others, it was betrayal, a shaming of his kind, a challenge to the order they believed unbroken. And as always, it was the whispers that cut deepest, not fists. Jing Lian felt them before she heard them. The first time she returned to town after that night, basket in her arms, she sensed the shift in the air. Women who once nodded politely turned their faces. Men stared too long, some with scorn, others with a hunger that unsettled. Even children, quick to mimic their parents, snickered behind their hands as she passed. She kept her head low, her shawl pulled tight, but the shame crawled across her skin as surely as the bruises had weeks before. At the general store, Mrs. Alcott, who had always offered her the smallest kindnesses, paused with the ledger in her hand. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, pity or disapproval, Jing could not tell. She accepted the flour and salt in silence, though her throat ached to speak, to tell her she had done nothing but try to survive. Words would not matter. They never had. When she returned to the ranch, Jackie was mending tack in the barn. He looked up, sensing the weight she carried, and said nothing. He did not ask what they had said. He only took the basket from her arms and set it down gently on the workbench, as though relieving her of more than flour and salt. She turned away quickly, tears pricking her eyes, ashamed to be so thin-skinned. But Jackie saw what she could not hide. That evening, as the sun sank crimson across the wide horizon, his sister Martha rode in. She was 30, her hair pinned tight beneath her bonnet, her frame lean from years of keeping a small farm alone. She dismounted with the ease of one who had done it since childhood and strode into the kitchen where Jing stirred stew. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the bubbling pot. Martha set down her gloves and spoke plainly. "Folks are talking. They'll talk worse before long." Jing's hands tightened on the wooden spoon, but Martha's voice softened. "Don't let them grind you down. They don't know half the courage it takes to stand where you stand." She pulled a folded shawl from her satchel, hand-stitched with small flowers, and set it on the table. "I thought you might use this against the wind." Jing's breath caught. She touched the fabric lightly, as though it were too fine for her hands. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jackie stood in the doorway, unseen until then, his arms crossed, his gaze unreadable. But something in his chest eased at the sight of his sister's gesture. Not all hearts in town were closed. Some still recognized dignity when they saw it. Later that week, old Jeremiah Klein stopped by. His beard was white, his back bent, his hands stiff with age, but his eyes were sharp. He leaned against his cane on the porch, speaking low to Jackie. "You're making enemies you don't need. That girl's marked now, and so are you. Folks won't forgive easy." Jackie listened without reply, only nodding once before Jeremiah rode off again, muttering to himself about a world too quick to judge. Jackie stayed long on the porch after, watching the land stretch endless before him, the cottonwoods shifting in the spring breeze. He knew Jeremiah was right. Yet he also knew he would not change his course. Days folded into one another, and something quiet began to grow between Jackie and Jing. Not in words, those were still scarce, but in gestures that spoke deeper. Jackie left small things by her window, a cluster of wildflowers, a feather fallen from a hawk, a smooth stone from the river. Jing, in turn, mended his coat without asking, patched a tear in his work shirt, placed tea by his bedside when he returned late from the fields. They moved around each other like two streams converging, gentle, inevitable. One afternoon, he led her out to the corral, where a chestnut mare tossed her head, spirited and untamed. He held the reins loosely, his voice low. "She needs a lighter hand than mine. You should ride her." Jing shook her head quickly, fear sparking in her eyes. "I cannot." "Yes, you can." She stood frozen, the reins trembling in her hand, but Jackie stepped close, his presence steady. He did not press, only waited. At last, she placed her foot in the stirrup, her breath quick, her heart racing. He guided her gently, his hand firm at her waist as she mounted. The horse shifted, restless, but under Jackie's calm voice and Jing's tentative grip, she steadied. For the first time since she had come west, Jing laughed, sudden and unguarded, as the mare trotted beneath her. The sound startled Jackie. It was rare as rain in drought, but it settled in him like warmth after years of cold. That night, as she lay in her small room, Jing thought of that laughter and how it had burst from her without permission. For a moment, she had forgotten bruises, forgotten whispers, forgotten the fear that had chased her across oceans. For a moment, she had simply been alive. But shadows lengthened. The Yates brothers, their pride wounded, began to stir others with them. In the saloon they muttered of Sutherland's betrayal, of how he'd turned his back on his own. They spoke of Jing not as a woman but as a mark against them, proof that outsiders were stealing what belonged to settlers. Whiskey fueled their words, and those words began to find ears too eager for trouble. Jing felt the change. When she went to town again, she caught sight of the brothers in the street, their eyes narrowed, their hands twitching as if they longed to grab her again. She quickened her steps, her pulse hammering, and nearly ran back to the ranch. That night, she sat by the fire, hands trembling in her lap, until Jackie asked softly what she feared. She turned her face toward him, her voice breaking. "They will not stop. They will take me, sell me, break me. That is all I have ever known." Jackie did not move for a long while, his gaze fixed on the flames. When he spoke, it was steady, certain, carved from the bedrock of his soul. "No one owns you here." The words struck through her like an arrow. She closed her eyes, tears slipping free, because no one had ever said them before. She had heard orders, bargains, threats, but never those words. Something unbroken stirred inside her, fragile but alive. The days that followed carried both dread and hope, a strange balance Jing did not know how to bear. In the mornings, the ranch glowed golden with sunlight, the fields dotted with wildflowers, the cottonwoods whispering with new leaves. At night, however, the horizon flickered with unease. Sometimes she thought she saw torches in the distance, only to blink and find nothing but starlight. One evening, as she stood at the window with a candle behind her, she saw it clear, a cluster of lights moving across the far fields, slow but certain. Her breath caught, her heart pounding. She turned toward Jackie, who was on the porch, sharpening a blade in the fading light. His eyes lifted, following her gaze, and he saw it too. Torches, weaving through the darkness, coming closer. Neither spoke. The silence between them was louder than any words. Jackie rose, slid the knife into its sheath, and stood tall against the horizon. The torches swayed in the night like fireflies, but their meaning was no gentle thing. Jing pressed her hand to the window, her fingers trembling. Fear twisted inside her, but alongside it, something steadier grew. For the first time in her life, she did not face the coming storm alone. Rain returned as if the heavens themselves had chosen sides, falling in slow sheets across the prairie, darkening the cottonwoods, turning the dirt road into blackened mire. The torches glowed through the downpour, wavering in the distance like angry stars, each step forward beating against the silence of the Sutherland ranch. Jackie Sutherland stood on the porch, his body a shadow etched by lightning, the sharpened knife at his belt, his chest bare beneath the rain. His breath rose in measured clouds, steady as the horse he had tied beneath the awning, its hooves restless but obedient to the calm of its master. Inside the cabin, Jing Lian clutched the window frame, her shawl damp at her throat, her face lit in flickers by the lantern flame. The men came slow, 7 or 8 in number, their voices carrying with the crackle of fire against storm. Franklin Yates walked at the front, his shoulders hunched, his grin hidden beneath the brim of his soaked hat. Beside him, Carl lumbered heavy, fists clenched as though the rain itself had insulted him. Behind them trailed others, settlers whose faces the town knew, men who had once tipped their hats to Jackie, men who had bought cattle from him, shared whiskey, nodded at his silence. Now they came with their pride wounded and their courage borrowed from each other's presence. Jackie did not move when they halted in the yard, mud sucking at their boots. Franklin raised his torch higher, its flames sputtering in the rain, and spat into the dirt. "You've gone soft, Sutherland. Hiding behind skirts that don't belong in this land. We come to collect what's ours." The rain hissed on the porch rail. Jackie's voice came low, calm, like a current beneath the storm. "She is not yours." Carl barked a laugh, ugly and wet. "Everything here is ours if we take it. Don't matter if it's land or cattle or woman. You stand in the way, you'll go down with her." The torchlight wavered, shadows stretching long across the yard. Lightning split the sky, revealing the hardness of Jackie's face, the stillness that was more dangerous than fury. He stepped forward 1 pace, bare feet striking the wet boards. His eyes never left Franklin's. "She is under my roof. That makes her mine to protect." A murmur rippled through the men, some shifting uneasily, for there was a weight in his words that pressed heavier than the storm. But Franklin sneered, unwilling to yield. You think you can shame us, Sutherland? Think you can strip us of our pride with your silence? You'll learn tonight who this land belongs to. He lunged first, torch swinging downward. Jackie moved like stone given sudden life, his arm sweeping the strike aside, his hand clamping hard on Franklin's wrist. The torch hit the mud with a hiss, flames sputtering out. In the same breath, Jackie struck. One measured blow that sent Franklin sprawling into the muck, gasping, torchlight painting his face in streaks of orange and shadow. Carl roared and charged, his bulk shaking the ground. Jackie met him head-on, their bodies colliding like bulls in the field. The porch rattled under the impact. Carl swung wide, fists like hammers, but Jackie caught his arm, twisted, and drove his shoulder forward. Carl staggered back, splashing into the mud, his grunt lost beneath the thunder. The others surged then, half from courage, half from fear of seeming cowards. Torches flew, fists raised. Jackie descended the steps with the calm of a man who knew storms had only one end. His knife flashed once, clean and sure, cutting through a sleeve, grazing skin, but he did not kill. He fought not with rage but with precision, each movement deliberate, each strike a warning carved into flesh and bone. One man's torch fell to the mud, extinguished. Another staggered back, clutching a bleeding arm. Inside, Jing pressed her hands to the glass, her breath fogging the window, tears streaking her face. She wanted to run, to stop them, to pull Jackie back from the storm, but her body would not obey. She had seen men fight before, but never like this, not with drunken wildness, but with the terrifying quiet of a man who knew his own strength and the worth of what he defended. Franklin scrambled to his feet, mud smeared across his face, fury twisted into something close to terror. You'll pay for this, Sutherland. You can't stand against all of us. Jackie turned slowly, rain slicking his hair to his shoulders, his chest rising steady despite the struggle. He looked at Franklin as one might look at a dying fire, patient, unmoved. Then come back with more, he said, voice low, each word like iron. Bring the whole town if you need. I'll be standing here still. The others faltered. Their torches sputtered in the downpour, their courage leaking out with every heartbeat. One by one, they stepped back, dragging Carl with them as he groaned, clutching his ribs. Franklin spat blood into the mud, his eyes burning with hatred but his body refusing to charge again. He turned, shoving past the others, his voice cracking through the rain. This ain't over. The men melted into the storm, their torches shrinking into the night until only the sound of rain remained. Jackie stood alone in the yard, chest heaving, mud streaked up his arms, water dripping from his jaw. Lightning flashed once more, painting him in stark relief, a man carved from silence, unbroken by noise. Jing burst from the door, running barefoot through the wet grass, her shawl falling behind her. She dropped to her knees in the mud beside him, her hands reaching for his arms, his chest, searching for wounds. He caught her wrists gently, steadying her. I'm whole. Her tears mingled with the rain, her face lifted to his. You could have died. His eyes softened, the storm inside him finally ebbing. Better me than you. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them, the rain falling soft, the prairie vast and endless around their small circle of warmth. She pressed her forehead to his chest, her body trembling, and for the first time in years, she let someone else carry the weight. Jackie closed his arms around her, not as a master or savior, but as a man who had chosen and would choose again. In the days that followed, the town could not ignore what had happened. Some muttered louder, anger sharpened by humiliation. Others fell silent, unwilling to stand against a man who had faced 7 and sent them crawling back. Children whispered of the fight, repeating it like a legend, while women measured Jing with new eyes, some softer, some harsher. Jackie did not speak of it. He rose each morning to tend cattle, to mend fences, to ride the fields as though nothing had shifted. But something had. The lines of solitude in his face eased when Jing walked beside him. She carried herself taller, her shawl wrapped not to hide but to keep out the wind. Together they moved through town once more, not hand in hand but side by side, and that was enough. Whispers followed, but so did a new silence, one born of respect too reluctant to speak its name. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Jackie stood with Jing on the porch. The prairie stretched endless, grasses swaying in the warm wind, sky vast above them. She looked up at him, her eyes dark and steady, no longer cast down in shame. "What if they return?" she asked. He turned his gaze outward, watching the cottonwood sway, the shadows lengthen. "Then I'll meet them again." She studied him, then nodded, as though the answer was enough. Because it was not the promise of safety that comforted her, but the certainty of belonging. The wind rose, carrying the scent of earth and rain, and for a long moment they stood together in silence, two souls bound not by law or custom, but by choice, by defiance, by the fragile but unbreakable truth that kindness was stronger than cruelty. And far off, unseen beyond the cottonwoods, a shadow stirred once more, men whispering, pride festering, a storm gathering again. The west itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting.